Morning, everybody. So we are on Chapter 10 lecture of our JavaScript book, which is working with jQuery, specifically forms and data validation in jQuery. And, we've already done form and data validation in JavaScript. And so hopefully you have those fundamentals down, and then really you just learn. This chapter, in my opinion, is just a twist on those fundamentals, because data validation, we understand what it is, we understand a lot of it, because we've done it in the JavaScript world, and so really you just got to figure out how it's different in jQuery. And hopefully it makes it a little bit easier, as jQuery usually does. So let's get into this. Kind of hop over the objectives as I've been doing. The first quarter of this chapter or so covers HTML5 validation. And so if we go back into what we've learned this semester, we reviewed validation just using the controls, like the input type of text, obviously a text box, the controls and their attributes. You'll remember things like required, to make a built-in text box a required field. And so, again, a lot of review in the first quarter of this chapter. We've seen all this before, if not once, if probably I think twice by now. And so it's a nice little thing to review. If we look at some of these, some of this code here, really what's new on this slide, I don't know anything. Hopefully you're getting kind of comfortable with this. The idea that you got a form tag, all of your controls are inside of the form tag. The form tag points you at a script, and that script can be PHP, it can be C#, it could be C++, it could be a bunch of different languages. It could be Ruby, it could be Python, it could be any sort of server-side script. Okay, so everything that we're coding here is mostly running in the client, but when you click the submit button, it sends the data that the user fills out, and it sends it to the server for processing. And what does that mean? That, well, whatever you want it to. If you're buying something on Amazon, if you're registering on Facebook, if you're sending a message from one person to another, these can all be forms that the server-side script takes that information and does something with it. And that's really generic, but that's because you can do just about anything with that information. And then there was a method of get and post. Remember the difference between those? The get versus the post. The get was in the URL. The post was more of a hidden form field, and so post was considered a little bit more secure than the get. Anyways, this is all all review here. So here you can kind of see, since this was submitted with a get method, a lot of the user's information is going to be put in what's called a query string. And so this is sent, the query string is just the data that's sent in the URL. For example, here, it's sending to the join PHP the email address ID. The user put in the value of Judy at Muroc.com. And so it's pretty much plain text. The first name field was then Judy. And so it's not secure, right? So we talked about get not being secure because all this data is just put bluntly in the URL, as you can kind of see down here on slide 5. A little bit of review, not a bad thing, right? And so these are the attributes that we just covered of the form tag, of the form element. These are your standard terms. All the controls on a form, An individual field would be an individual piece of data, right? So the control is the element on the screen, like a drop-down list or a text box, and then a field is an individual piece of data, like your first name field. Submit button sends it to the server. The reset button resets it to the default values. And what we're talking about today is data validation, which brings to mind, one thing that I've talked about briefly is why do we do data validation? The big important thing behind data validation you're looking to put good information into a system, good data into a system. The reason you might have heard this before, good data in, good data out. I mean, it's a pretty simple thing. Good data in, good data out. Bad data in, bad data out. Makes sense, right? But it's important. Good data in, good data out. Bad data in, bad data out. Well, why is that important? If you get bad data out of a system, what happens what am I talking about when bad data is out? So all this information is being stored on hard drives, and ultimately people want to use this information to manage their business effectively. Okay. Yeah, guys, homework is just lecture notes. So if you're taking notes, that's what the homework is going to be on this chapter. All right. So good data in, good data out. Bad data in, bad data out. Big wigs at companies use the information in their IT systems to make business decisions. Okay? Before computer systems, these giant corporations did not exist like they do today. They didn't exist because managers were not using large groups of data to make business decisions. Okay, managers in the past, would manage their companies based on their instincts, based on their understanding of the business, which was limited because they weren't looking at lots of information summarized. Okay, nowadays with these IT systems, you can take huge pools of information, lots of information, and you can extract relevant information out of it to make better business decisions. Okay, and so, I always remember this one example. I was, they call it data analytics. You're analyzing data. And so this is really relevant to me. So I'm in my mid 30s, and I was reading a data analytics site some years ago, and they were studying, this was Target, okay? Target as a company, giant company, big companies like Target, again, used to not be able to exist on the scale that they do today with the size and quantities and successful of how they run their business. Target was studying dads, okay? And what Target found was that if a dad came in to pick up diapers, okay, there was a 65% chance, a relatively high percent chance that dad would also purchase a case of beer, okay? And so what does, again, they study all this information. They study thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of data points to draw this correlation that, hey, if you buy one thing, you're also likely to buy this other thing. And so in general, what does Target do with that information? They put I don't know if that's the case today, that the beer is next to the diapers, but that's essentially what they do. They lay out their store so that if you walk in just to pick up a pack of diapers, that you're also, likely to pick up that 6-pack of beer or wine or whatever it was. Okay. And so by studying masses of amounts of information, okay, they can extract trends and therefore change how they run their business. Getting all these notifications. Change how they run their business to run the business more efficiently. Okay, let me pull this back in. Well, if you have good information that goes into the system, then you can make good decisions and run your data more efficiently. Okay, but if you let bad information into the system, that when they run these reports that are analyzing all this information, the business leaders are more than likely going to make bad decisions. So really, it can lead to more profitability for the company, right? Which is just one reason for good data validation. Besides the fact that it can just be frustrating to be working with a bad data set, a bad information set. Okay, so that's just one reason why we do data validation. And again, it leads to companies like Target and like Walmart and like Amazon. You go back 50 years ago, these companies did not exist at the scale they do today because of the business decisions they've made to more effectively sell their products. And the reason they can do that is because they're making decisions based on good data that's been put into their system. Some of the built-in HTML5 controls that we have: input type of email, URL, tell. Again, this is nothing new. These are all the built-in HTML5 controls. So, input type email is going to get you to validate. Your web browser will do some validation to get something that looks like an email address. Now, can you still fake it out and say bob@bob.com? Yes, you can still fake out an email. Your web browser's built-in validation controls, ultimately to verify their email address, you need to send them a confirmation email, and they have to verify it, which is something we learned how to do in your third semester, okay, to get the email verification. But then even then, they could have a fake email address or a junk email address, and so it's pretty challenging to make sure that you can only do so much to make sure you got a good email. You might remember the Autofocus attribute, which will put focus on a control when the page loads. This is all just built into HTML5. The placeholder, which puts some like gray text, and so you can kind of suggest a format for something, like a format for a phone number with 3 digits, hyphen, 3 digits, hyphens, 4 digits. Okay, and as soon as you start to type, it'll erase the placeholder text. Now the downfall of this, right? So why do we need JavaScript? If we could just use HTML5, shouldn't we just use HTML5? And in many cases, the answer to that is yes. Like, if you can solve a problem with HTML and CSS and not use JavaScript, that's going to be more efficient, not only from a coding standpoint, because you don't have to write JavaScript, but from a performance standpoint as well. Okay, so it's always going to be faster to solve a problem with just HTML and CSS than having to incorporate JavaScript. So if you can do it, that's fine. But the problem with this, there's a couple of problems. Number one, they're just not, these built-in HTML5 attributes, they're not uniformly supported. And what I mean by that is the page is going to look one way in Chrome, it's going to look another way in Firefox. Now that they're using Edge uses, I think, Chromium. So it might look the same way in Edge as it does in Chrome. But if you go back to the older Internet Explorer, it'll look like IE11. It'll look a different way in IE11. So they're not uniform. Okay, so that's one problem. The other problem is, depending on the browser might support these validation attributes. It might not. Okay. So again, these are the HTML5 attributes that I'm talking about. The required attribute, the title will kind of get you a tooltip, a pattern for regular expressions, no validate will tell you to ignore it as validation, and autocomplete will allow your browser to use its cookies, for like the first name field. If you want to use your computer's cookies to autocomplete first names that you filled out before, you can use this autocomplete attribute. But again, not all browsers support all of this, and if they do support it, they kind of, the way they support it varies. Okay, so you wind up having, not non-uniform experience across different browsers, which of course our goal is always to have a uniform experience cross-browser. And like we learned in our HTML class, we do have some pseudo classes for required fields, for valid and invalid fields. And so remember what pseudo classes are, like a::link. That allows us to select all of our anchor tags that are links, a::visited, all the anchor tags that have been visited. And so we use these pseudo classes in our CSS to select all of the required fields, all of the valid fields, and we can style them a certain way. And so again, just a little bit of a review, they use this regular expression. If you recall from the HTML portion of the class, a regular expression is a sort of code that allows you to write complete custom validation for a field. And so this says, you're going to start this telephone input with 3 digits, followed by a hyphen, followed by 3 more digits, followed by a hyphen, followed by 4 digits. Okay, and so this is a custom code that allows you to write completely custom, and you can write validation for any way that you can want to accept the data. You can write a regular expression for that. And again, so some of the reasons why the built-in HTML validation isn't enough. Okay, and I kind of touched on both of those points already. Well, I guess the other thing I didn't really hit on is that second bullet, is that you can do more with JavaScript validation than what you can do with the built-in HTML5 attributes. And what I mean by do more is you can really write custom code to do whatever you want, as we did when we wrote just standard JavaScript validation. Okay. So if we're going to study validation in jQuery, one of the first things that will help us is to understand how to actually make unique jQuery selections. And so we can do that with our jQuery selector. Now remember, our jQuery selectors so far have been CSS selectors. So if you can select a class, you can select an ID, you can select a descendant, an adjacent selector. All of our regular CSS selectors are what we've used for jQuery so far. However, now that we're working specifically with forms, these are a list of selectors that allows us to select all of our input controls, for example. So you put this inside of a selector, and let me kind of jump ahead and show you a little bit of the code so you can kind of see how this is a unique selector. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. So here, you'll notice we're selecting all of our radio buttons with :radio. And so maybe before all of your radio buttons had a name, and you would just target that or a class, not a name, I would say. We would put a class on all of our radio buttons. That would be another way of kind of doing the same thing. But what's nice about these jQuery selectors is you just do colon and then the control type. And now we have an event handler on all of our radio buttons. And we say, okay, if any of our radio buttons change, run this anonymous function. And so, basically we're running this code if any of our radio buttons change. You'll notice here, we're also running a selector here that says whichever radio button is checked. And so this is basically one selector after another. It's like chaining our selectors, right? So it's any of our radio buttons that are checked. And so let me go back to this list. And so you can see that's kind of a combination of these two pieces right here. Any radio button that is checked. Okay? So earlier how I said, it's really not too different. Data validation is really not too different. You're still checking to see, if the text box is blanked, is empty, then you give it an error message and say, you got to fill this out. The same thing in jQuery. You say, okay, if this text box is empty, then we have to fill out the text box. It's just maybe we're selecting a little bit different. See here? This goes into the email text box. It reads the value out of the text box, and it does a trim. Okay, and I'm kind of jumping ahead of the lecture a little bit, but a trim, what that does is it removes white space that a user might have left in there by accident. So if in their first name, if they type in their first name and then they accidentally put a space in there, right? My name's Evan, right? 4 characters, but I accidentally type in a space, a 5th character, that space is not needed. And so a trim trims the white space on the front and the back of the text. And so this trim function is pretty useful in getting rid of accidental white space. Okay, but then here you'll notice we're storing this in a variable, this email. And then basically, if the email is blank, then we give the user an error message that says this field is required. So again, we're still using JavaScript if statements. Really, the process isn't too different. Just our events are a little bit different. Our selectors are a little bit different. But by and large, a lot of it's the same. If it's blank, then do this. If the passwords don't match, then give them an error message, so on and so forth. Okay, so these are just selectors that allow us to select our controls more efficiently. But, you could select by ID and by class the same way. This just adds more flexibility, right? So all of the input types of password, if you just want to select your password text box, :password. Select the submit button, :submit. So it's flexibility. It allows you to select your elements differently. And then, like I showed a little bit before, we got value and trim. Now again, just as a reminder, if you're doing a read out of a text box, then you're just doing dot value. So this is a read operation. And this other one is a write operation. And so what you would do on this case, you would, maybe select, your first name text box, dot value, and then if you wanted to write something in there, you would put, So that's how I would put something into a text box using jQuery, using this value. And in here, this is called the argument that you pass to the value method. Right, so value is a method. It's a method. We know that because it has parentheses. And then what goes inside of it is what's called an argument, or the data that you pass to the method. And then if you don't put anything inside of the method, then it's a read operation. And what you do with a read operation, like I demonstrated earlier, is you would maybe read that and store that into a variable so that you could then use that variable throughout your code. And then again, I already described what a trim is, but a trim is just a useful operation to get rid of white space where you don't need it. All right, and so just a couple of examples here. Selecting the age text box, reading the value out of it, parsing it to an int. Again, this is still, JavaScript mixed with jQuery. So parseInt is still a function that if we're going to do some math based on the user's age, you might want to go ahead and parse that to an int so you can do some addition. Really nothing has changed about that. And same thing here, we're reading the first name text box, or storing it in a variable, and then in this case we're putting that variable's value back into the first name text box. So it's just a read operation demonstrated on slide 19, and right beneath that is a write operation. And so all this does is it trims the white space that the user might have accidentally put in there, and it puts it back into the text box without the white space. So that's what those two lines would do. Now, what's unique about slide 20, again, is a couple things, okay? So the first thing about slide 20 is our selection. This is called an attribute selector. And so we're selecting all input controls that have a name attribute with a value of contact by, okay? And we haven't done attribute selectors a lot, okay? But you might remember them from the 30 CSS selectors that you must memorize article that I referenced, okay? But again, it's not selecting all the input controls, but only the ones that contain a name attribute of contact by. So again, if I'm thinking about your radio buttons, they're going to have the same name. So you have 5 radio buttons that all have the same name. That allows you to put them in a group so that you can only select one. Well, then if they're all in a group that you can only select one, only one of them is going to be checked. So we've got a radio button group where we're selecting only the checked radio button, and then that's going to have a value attribute that we're going to read. So if I'm imagining the HTML here, and here's 3 different and then you would do something like IL, MO, IN. So what the user sees is this text right here. This is what the user sees, but the value attribute is what is used in the JavaScript to read and store. So you could only click on store in this variable. You can only click on one of these. You can only click on one of these because they all have the same name. What the user sees is outside of the tag, but what the JavaScript uses is the value attribute that's coded here. So again, how to get the value of the checked radio button in a group would be like that. Again, nothing, you know, this is a relatively easy lecture to give because there's really not, you know, it's not brand new information. It's just kind of a twist on what I think you should already know. Okay, folks, we're back from a short break, and not a whole lot left in this lecture, quite honestly. You know, if we're looking at slide 21, what we have on the first line is an array, right? You have an array when you want to store multiple pieces of information. And so we set that array on line 2, we set that array equal to a jQuery selector, the ID of select list, which you'll remember the HTML for a drop-down list is a select tag. Right? And then inside of that select, you have options. Okay? And then you can set the multiple attribute that allows you to hold down like the control key and select multiple options. So if you remember this control, this is a drop-down list that would allow you to select multiple options, and that you would store whatever the user selected in an array using that little bit of jQuery there. Okay, so that's getting multiple selected options from a drop-down list. Then we're taking a look on slide 22 at some different events. So these are events for forms. And so, for example, you could say when the text box receives focus, and inside here they have handler. So let me give you an idea of what this code would actually look like. So let's target the first name text box dot focus, and then the handler is typically your anonymous function. Right? Do this when the first name text box receives focus. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. It's not necessarily putting focus into the text box, but it's saying, hey, this is an event that when this event happens on a control, you know, run this, what's called an event handler. And you could do that on focus, you could do that on blur, you could do that on change. And so as they demonstrate on this, when you have a contact me radio button and that radio button is changed, meaning its value goes from checked to unchecked or unchecked to checked, and whatever, it just, the value is changing. You run an anonymous function here that runs a little bit of jQuery, JavaScript. Okay, so a change event can be on a text box, it could be on a button, a radio button, or a checkbox, I should say. A select, so you've got a drop-down list like we had here, right? And you could say when one of those items is selected, run some code, or when this last one, when a submit button runs its submit code, or is actually clicked, you could run a submit event. Okay, so this is an example of, again, running a change event on this checkbox. So these are your events, in other words. Right, so kind of covering this again real quick, these are some different selectors that we can make with jQuery. Couple of methods in jQuery, value, and trim. How to select an individual value from a radio button group. How to select multiple options from a list. And these are different jQuery events. And whereas these are events like this, okay, there's also a focus method which causes an event to happen, right? So here, if I target the first name text box and do .focus, okay, that causes the cursor to go to that text box. And it says for triggering events. So this is writing the jQuery that causes the event to run. Whereas this is what runs when that occurs. And so, you can write jQuery, which then would trigger this event to run. Or if the user would click the first name text box, that would cause this event to run. So what I'm trying to say, I don't know how well I'm saying it, is that this event would run if the user clicks the first name text box, or if the jQuery focus method runs. And the jQuery focus method is what I'm talking about down here at slide 24. Okay, so I guess what I'm saying is it could be triggered in two ways. It could be triggered by the jQuery, or it could be triggered by the user interacting with the page. Same thing with blur, same thing with change, same thing with select, same thing with submit. So submit's a useful one in that specifically for validation, so what you would do is inside of the submit handler, so the submit handler might look like this. Let me code up the submit handler. So we would say target the button submit dot submit So again, what we're doing is we're targeting the submit button, and we're saying when the submit event occurs, let's go ahead and evt.prevent default. So we stop the submit event from occurring. And then you could say if page is valid. If the page is valid, then you can, and maybe I should just be doing this in the editor. I don't know why today I decided to do more of the code on the slides instead of doing it in Visual Studio. If the page is valid, then let's go ahead and submit the form. Else, we know the code is not valid. Else, provide an error message. Kind of went off the slide there a little bit. Whoops. This is why I should have done it in Visual Studio. My apologies here. So this is the submit event. On the submit event, we go ahead and cancel the default behavior. And then this is where we run our validation code. Is inside of this submit event. This is where we check for validation, and if it's valid, then we go ahead and submit it to the server. Otherwise, we give the user an error message. So this is going to be, I mean, this is a big chunk of providing validation in jQuery, is just getting it to this point where the user clicks the submit button, it runs a submit event, we prevent that default event from happening. And if it's good, go ahead and continue the submit event. But if it's bad, let's provide an error message instead. And here's an example of a regular button, not a submit button, that we can still run a submit method on a regular button. If it's not a submit button, we could still run a submit method. And actually, one thing that I did incorrect is in my code to submit. When you submit on the submit button, we actually have to target the form. So you run the submit method on the form, not the submit method on the button. We submit the form here. Okay, and then several coding examples from the chapter. What I'm going to recommend, as I always do, and hopefully this kind of prepared you for the last hands-on test. I think if you have been coding along, and each chapter, I'd say for the past 3 or 4 chapters, I'm always recommending you do the coding examples in the book. I think doing those coding examples in the book is a good tool to get some practice before you're doing it on your own, right? The lab is more doing it on your own. Coding it from the book is, more of a learning exercise. And so if you've been doing the code from the book, and by doing your labs, I think that prepared you fairly well for the last hands-on test, because a lot of what was in that last hands-on test was just a modification of these coding examples that were in the book, like slideshows and different sorts of calculations that you could do. So as I've been recommending these, I'm going to continue to recommend that you code these different applications in the book for practice today. So one of which is this membership form. So I recommend that you guys code this out of the book. They give you the JavaScript for it as well. Okay. If you finish that, again, I would just code the examples, all of the examples in the book. You could do this exercise 10-1 for practice, not a grade. And then tomorrow, if you want to get a jump start on the labs, you know what the labs are. The labs are the extras. And you have the PDF for the extras. So kind of a short lecture today. Again, because I don't think there's like a ton of brand new information. It's just a twist on validation that we've already done before. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here.